I'm so excited to introduce our next speaker. We are going to be hearing next from Bill Batchelor. And Bill Batchelor is going to be telling us about MITRE ATT&CK, an awesome topic, mapping, and the world's best muffins. I am excited for both of those things. So tell you a little bit about Bill. Bill has over 8 years cybersecurity experience, having previously served as senior intrusion researcher at CrowdStrike's Overwatch threat hunting group. Other experiences include incident responder, security operations manager, and technical intelligence leader at various financial institutions. He holds an MBA in information technology from New York University and SANS certifications focused on threat hunting, threat detection, and incident response. Prior to cybersecurity, he spent 20 years in programming, web hosting, and enterprise architecture. In his spare time, he is a complete hack in the kitchen. I don't believe that. He's about to provide us with the world's best muffins. So I'm so excited for this talk, Bill. Thank you for joining us and donating some time today. Take it away.
Super. Thanks so much, Leslie. Yeah, as mentioned, today is MITRE ATT&CK mapping and the world's best muffins. So why don't we dive right in? So first of all, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And I also want to thank Leslie and everyone who's worked so hard to make this possible today. The one thing I will say, I've been in cybersecurity now for 8 years. I've used MITRE ATT&CK to analyze literally hundreds of intrusions. And I really want to share with you some of the things that I learned along the way about MITRE ATT&CK. First of all, why are we here today? I want to help you get some insight into how we use MITRE ATT&CK, not just theoretically, but in practice. How we can look at intel reports and extract from those the techniques that the threat actors used. We're going to use ATT&CK to deconstruct not just simple one-liners, but we're going to go in, dig a little deeper, and see what MITRE ATT&CK can reveal for us about adversaries' behaviors. My goal here today is to leave you with knowledge so you can go back, go back to your studies, go back to work, and use MITRE ATT&CK proficiently to map the techniques and behaviors that threat actors use and put those into your research, your intrusion analyses, and intel that you generate and share with others. But we all get hungry during our late night research and during incident response. I like to bake, so we're also going to talk food. The world's best muffins and the story behind them is going to be the second topic, and I'm going to share some resources, meaning recipes and a couple tips, so you can try those at home too. So with MITRE ATT&CK, first of all, what is it for those of you who may not be as familiar? Basically, MITRE is a framework for describing the TTPs of a cyber attack. It's structured. It's based on real-world observations and real-world behaviors that have been observed in attacks and intrusions. And those techniques are presented in a matrix, given across the top by tactics and broken down logically. But not just the techniques are listed, but also, more importantly, the procedures behind those, specific examples of how a threat actor used that technique in an attack. It's also practitioner and community driven, which makes it so useful. Publicly available intel, as well as specific contributions from researchers and analysts, are baked in, sort of no pun intended there, into the framework itself. As researchers, we help suggest new observations as techniques, and we submit those to MITRE, and they build those into the framework either as new techniques or procedures under existing ones. What comes out of that is a knowledge base of threat actor techniques and allows us to associate the threat actors with the way they behave, and that's what's so important here. So it helps tell not just what happened, but also gives us insight into how it happened. So for example, we know the threat actor moved laterally, but what enabled that technique? When we start to get down to that level, we can start to tell a story of how the attack transpired. And fundamentally, MITRE is a skill that you really need to have if you're going into cybersecurity. You need to understand the framework and how it's used, both to produce research and intel on your own, and also when you're reading reports so you understand how it all fits together. So now that we know what it is, why do we use it? Well, one thing of common with any framework, and especially MITRE, is gives us a common vocabulary. And by doing that, it gives us a common understanding among each other as a cybersecurity community. For example, if I talk about lateral movement, RDP, in the context of MITRE, we all know what that means. It's also a tool or an aid for structured analysis. It helps us identify TTPs that we see in an intrusion that we're looking at ourselves during our incident response, during the production of intel reports. When we go through and look at the what transpired in an attack, MITRE helps us put some structure behind that and identify the TTPs associated. And exactly how to do that is what we're going to look at today with a few examples. MITRE also helps us track trends in adversary attacks and share those findings, share those trends as intel and research with each other via reports, heat maps, etc. It allows us to surface the TTPs which were most common over time and with which threat actors, and that's where we get a lot of value out of that as practitioners. I also want to point you to something earlier this year from Jamie Williams, who works at MITRE. At the last SANS Cyber Threat Intelligence Summit, he did a great presentation titled "Let's Be Honest About MITRE Attack Mappings and the So What." If you're interested in MITRE, I also suggest you take a look at that. Excellent work. So let's take a look at a real world example of a report and how MITRE was integrated into that report. This is a report from CISA, and it explains basically how threat actors are exploiting an external gateway device, which is very common these days. The technique for initial access here was exploit public-facing application. So it's a very common, straightforward technique. And mapping something like this is fairly simple. It's very straightforward. But what about things that are not so straightforward? For example, if you look down a little further here, you'll see that PowerShell was used for execution. That's where it starts to get a little more complex, because someone didn't just run PowerShell and walk away. There's a lot more baked into the execution of the PowerShell command line than typically what first meets the eye. So that's going to be our first example, PowerShell. PowerShell is a technique used for execution. So MITRE breaks down different things by tactic, and execution is one of those. PowerShell is very common. It's very commonly used also to download additional tooling for subsequent stages in the attack. And not only is it just executed, but the adversary also often either encodes or somehow obfuscates the cmdlets and arguments within the PowerShell command line to avoid detection. So base 64 encoding, which you see here, is very typical. And sometimes even behind that, once you decode that, you'll see things like broken strings and other things where instead of you'll do string substitution and anything they can to, they're kind of simple techniques to avoid detection. What we're doing here was we're going to take a look at a simple PowerShell command that was base 64 encoded. And I highlighted the things that we want to tag with MITRE to help describe what we've observed so far. We observed PowerShell. So if you look on the lower right, we see the MITRE technique T1059.001 PowerShell and its parent command and scripting interpreter. We also see that they're using, we're passing in the encoded command parameter. Well, that leads us to command obfuscation and its parent technique, obfuscated files or information. The adversary is obfuscating the information so that this is a defense evasion technique. So, but what else can we see here? Right now, not really too much. If you have PowerShell logging enabled, the Windows will actually decode what it can for you from base 64. But maybe you don't have that, or maybe for some reason you need to do this manually. So we're going to take that step and do that manually and see how we do that and what that leads, what it reveals for us. So I used here a very common tool used in cybersecurity, CyberChef. And we're going to use that to take the base64 encoded string and make it human readable. So we need to do 2 steps there. Number 1, we need to do the base64 decoding. So CyberChef works on the algorithms basically are called recipes. So I have a from base64 recipe in there. And also, once we do that, we also have to decode the text, because what we have is given to us in the UTF-16 little endian, and we need to get that over to UTF-8 so it looks a little cleaner and we can read it. So we have those 2. And what we get after we do that, we bake it. I hope you notice that I picked this purposely because we're talking about muffins later on. We get a few extra things revealed. So before we saw the PowerShell, now we see also a couple of interesting things here. We see the web client I highlighted, download file, and we see a Windows style hidden. And these things are very important. The adversary is bringing tooling in by using the web client, using that to download a file. And when that is executed, the PowerShell window is being, in this case, the malware PancakesCon, which is just a demo thing that I built, is being opened in a hidden window. Also a defensive evasion technique. So that allows me to look at my MITRE techniques and add several to that list. So from the download file, we get T1130 ingress tool transfer, which is a C2 technique. We get T1071.001 web protocols from the web client and HTTPS. We see that coming through that way. Application layer protocol, web protocols. And again, Windows style hidden, defense evasion, so hide artifacts, and hidden window. We're going to talk a little bit how I got from the command line to the MITRE techniques when we look at the next example. Another note that I want to make is that if PancakesCon was actually a malicious payload, we would also tag what it attempted to do. So for example, perhaps it had some shellcode in it, it was trying to do some kind of process injection, or if it was a ransomware executable, it might be trying to encrypt our data, something like that. We'd want to take it a little bit further. If it's an executable, we can look at it with things like strings and so forth, but we might need to pass that, either through a sandbox or to a reverse engineer to extract additional information for our MITRE tagging. So you do need to work with other people and bring them into this. So our second example, we're going to look at it this time, it's rather than a command line, we're going to look at a particular tool, WMI-exec. This is part of a tool set called MPacket. MPacket purportedly is a collection of open source Python modules for working with network protocols. But in reality, and more commonly, it's something we see abused by threat actors and also used a lot by red teams. What does it do? It allows you to get a semi-interactive shell on a target host. And we use that for lateral movement because we can execute commands on the remote host through that shell. It's semi-interactive. We'll take a look more deeply into that because the shell doesn't persist. Each time the command executes, it opens a new shell. So that's the semi-interactive part. So you don't get the nice command history. You can't toggle through it. So you have to be a little careful as an operator when you use this. And you'll actually sometimes see threat actors make mistakes. WMI-exec requires valid admin credentials, and that's an important point. Uses DCOM to establish connection, port 135 RPC port, and connects into the WMI provider host on the target endpoint. Uses, you have a choice as an operator to choose either command shell, which is default, or you can specify PowerShell to invoke commands on the target or victim endpoint. And it doesn't just, it's not an interactive shell, so it doesn't pass that output from those commands directly back to you. How it does that is it writes out a temporary file and uses SMB to establish another connection to the target endpoint and read that output from that temp file. And once everything's done, it deletes that temp file later on. So the question is, how did I know that? And that's what we're going to find out. So also important in MITRE tagging is to know where to look for things. So in this case, if you have a tool, and this is an open source tool, I suggest looking at the source code for that tool because there's lots of good information in there. What I was able to pull out of here, I see in the description that it executes commands to WMI. The user has to be admin. It needs DCOM. right? I see something about base 64 encoding here. Again, see a common theme here. SMB connections, DCOM connections, WMI. I see the command shell. I see the option here for a PowerShell. And if PowerShell, I see that we're going to use base 64 encoding, decoding. I see down below here after the command executes, the output is being redirected here to this a temporary file. That's the one with the greater than sign. And then right below that, the delete file is the basically cleaning up after itself. So trying not to leave artifacts behind for forensics folks to find later on. So basically you have a lot of great stuff here. In this case, you don't need to be a reverse engineer to find it. You just need to know where to look. So let's take a look at MPacket a little closer in the context of the two machines and the connections that get established. This will help us determine how we want to map this and what techniques we can extract from this. First of all, on the left, we have the compromised endpoint from which the attacker was operating. And they brought their WMI exec tooling to that endpoint in a previous stage of the attack. So we're looking at it from the point where they executed this and connected over to the target endpoint. So when WMI is executed, you'll see that DCOM connection going across the top, port 135. After that initial connection is established, there's a secondary connection open and using an ephemeral port, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You'll see the net stats I ran. And then you use this SMB to collect the responses. You'll see the connection at port 445 there. And WMI provider host is the kind of parent process of everything that's going on there. So on the left, you'll see the Linux shell from which I ran this. You'll see the command execution of WMI exec. The fake admin ID I created for this, I called PancakesAdmin, and I just pass that in with the IP or hostname of the target, and it'll prompt me for a password. I can also use a hash. That's a different command invocation, but that's also possible, just for completeness of let you know about that. You'll see everything being established here, and then I get a C prompt. Once I got that C prompt, I typed in hostname, and I got back the hostname of the target endpoint, at which point then I stopped for the purposes of this demo. If you're running a commercial EDR or next-gen AV tool, it will collect a lot of this information, and it will present it to you in a format similar to this process monitor output at the bottom of the screen. So what you see here is basically I've collected all this information while I was running this and just filtered it for certain events to create this kind of process timeline with parent processes that you can follow. You see WMI provider host as the parent of this command shell. And then you'll see when you see that I executed the hostname, if you trace it back, you'll see that the command shell was the parent of that. And WMI exec again was the parent of that command shell. So you can kind of see what's going on. This is a great tool to use if you're just experimenting in a home lab. If you're working out kind of in a SOC somewhere, as a threat hunter in IR, you'll typically have a commercial tool that'll provide this information for you again. After that, we'll jump up, and I collected the information on the network connections from the target endpoint. I went in there, ran a net stat, and filtered that for the attacker's endpoint just to see what was coming in from there. And you can observe, you see the RPC port 135 into which the DCOM connection is connecting into WMI provider host. You see the SMB port opened from which the attacker is collecting the responses, through WMI exec, and you see that ephemeral port established also. So one other thing to note, right below here, we have the cmd.xcx, invoking host name. And what's interesting about this, we talked about the command redirection on the previous slide, the one in the greater than sign that was in the code. The way you see the command written out here, you see it's using the Windows admin share. And it's also writing the information to this file named __17, etc., etc. This is basically an epoch timestamp, so it's not really useful to me as is. But these are very unique artifacts for MPacket. I also note that there's a WMI exec also as part of crack map exec. Sorry, that's a tongue twister. And instead of writing an epoch timestamp, that writes just a random 6-digit. So if you see either one of those in basically your Windows admin share, that should be an indication that something kind of suspicious is going on. But in this case, with MPacket, we need to do something with that to find out more. There are various websites out there that will do epoch time conversions for you. And just as I gave you one here, so as kind of as a take-home exercise, I want you to try and find out what day did I run this script. I mean, obviously the time is obvious; it's listed over here on the left. But if you pass that epoch time convert, pass that time stamp through the string through the epoch converter, it'll tell you what day I did it also, so you can see what day I put this slide together. So going into the technique mapping itself. So what do we now know about WMI exec? So this is kind of what I listed through on the first slide and what we were able to prove through the code and looking at the elements of the attack when we put it together on the previous slide. We connect to a WMI host provider, DCOM, valid admin credentials, and so forth. We talked about these in detail already. So let's look at WMI provider host and see how do we map that to MITRE. First thing I do is I use the search box in MITRE in the upper right to simply put in, some applicable text that you're, from your research. And this time I'm just going to put in WMI provider host, hit enter, and see what's returned. In the search results, I notice the third one down is actually a technique. Now these are broken down. You'll see sometimes you'll see threat actors, you'll see data sources, all sorts of things. We're interested in the techniques that surface through the search. If I had one wish through MITRE, for MITRE, I wish they would give me a filter so I could just say, give me techniques only, or tactics only, or etc. But you have to kind of hunt and peck for the techniques. One of the first ones that comes up is Windows Management Instrumentation. And when I read that, I find all the elements that I found in my attack. So this is something I definitely want to attach to this research, as a MITRE tag. So I will note that as T1047 Windows Management Instrumentation. And you can go ahead and do that for each one of these lines, looking for DCOM, valid admin credentials, command shell, and so forth, SMB. And it'll use the same process and for each one of those, pull out the MITRE techniques. And what you'll end up with is something like this next slide here. So this is the first one we did. WMI provider host, we got Windows Management Instrumentation. Just for DCOM, we see remote services and distributed component object model. So our DCOM is here. And for each one of these, I went through and did that. I'm going to leave you the second take-home exercise is to go through the things on the observations on the left and see if you can pull out and through the same kind of search technique using MITRE search, see if you can get to these techniques, and see what you come up with and compare it to what's here. You may come up with more, that's okay. You may come up with less. Not everyone's going to find exactly the same thing. If I gave this to 5 different analysts, I would have very similar results, but they wouldn't always be the same. But I want you to at least look what's on here and see if you can at least figure out why I tagged the ones that are here. So that is pretty much those are our 2 examples for today. So let's wrap up MITRE before we get to the next part of the presentation. What did we learn today? So we learned how to use MITRE to describe techniques used by a threat actor during an intrusion or some kind of other attack. One thing is we want to emphasize is the common vocabulary aspect of MITRE, giving us that common understanding. That's what's so important about it, that with a common understanding, we can share things with each other. The structured analysis aid, right? If we're all using the same framework and using it in the same way, we should come out with fairly similar results, and that provides structure to our analysis. And also, super important is tracking trends, right? This assists me in discovering how adversaries are behaving, and that's what's so important. When I understand how adversaries behave, I can decide where best to apply my finite set of resources to defend against them. There is no world in which you have unlimited money and unlimited personnel and unlimited time. So everything is scarce, and by having a better understanding of how adversaries behave, you can better understand risk and better understand how you deploy your resources. So if you're more interested in some extra training on MITRE, I put a link here for some tutorials that MITRE provides. They're a little old at this point, but they're still very relevant. They go back to, I think, attack version 6, almost back in 2018, I think, some of them. But they're still very, very applicable, and they're very good. And the important point here, and why I'm giving this to you and give you these examples, is that practice makes perfect. Okay. There are a lot of free intrusion reports and blogs written by analysts and researchers. Download those, read through them, try to understand what happened. And if you want to practice, try mapping those back to MITRE ATT&CK. There is, at the end, I will point you to a GitHub repo where I have some of these things stored, including the slide deck. And I have a list of kind of free and open source intrusion reports and blogs where you can pick some of this up. So hopefully that'll be useful to you also. Currently, for references and further research for things that I used in this slide deck, I listed here some of the sources and a few extra resources. First, the GitHub repo is there where some of these are. I'll leave a little time on here if you want to do a screen capture. But I know it's going to be a little bit before the videos are published. And then some of these other things go a little bit deeper into WMI-exec and PowerShell and CyberChef. So feel free to do some research on your own. Okay, so I'm sure we have some questions at this point. I leave room for questions at the end. And then any that I don't get to, I promise I will do my best to answer all your questions at that time. So part 2, what better to accompany a late night research or Intel report writing or what have you? This is not an industry we get into because we like to sleep. Working on a late night incident, you have to have something to eat, right? For me, there's nothing better than muffins. Aside from the IR support and the great late night snack, they make a quick and easy breakfast. They're great with afternoon coffee, and they're super portable, right? You can take them with you. They're pretty low maintenance. So history behind this a little bit. I got tired of muffins at one point. I really like these things called Madeleines. They're kind of a almond-based, it's halfway between a muffin and a cookie, but they're kind of fussy to make. I do like to bake, but I don't have a lot of time, and I don't have a lot of time for fussy. So what I did is I like muffins, and I really like Madeleines, so I merged the 2 recipes together to make something a little bit easier. Basically, I call it the great taste of Madeleines with the ease of a muffin, and that's what made it the world's best, in my opinion. You're basically baking a muffin in a Madeleine tin, but we'll see how that works. So what's in these things? Well, the basic batter, you'll see, whether I make it as a muffin or as a Madeleine, is the same. Same ratios. For Madeleines, I scoped this here for basically 1 tin, which is typically 12. Muffins, depending on the size, it might make 6 to 10. It's pretty much double the Madeleine recipe. The 2 differences are in sugar and baking powder. The Madeleines, you'd like to have a little bit of extra rye, so you see the ratio there is a little bit higher, so a little extra baking powder. And also, because there's like somewhere between a muffin and a cookie, I put a tiny bit extra sugar in there. In both cases, they are not obnoxiously sweet. Quick to make these. Combine all your dry ingredients, the first 5, mix those well in a bowl. Make sure your sugar and baking powder and salt are well distributed, and then make a well in the middle. You'll see in the top right, that's just the dry ingredients pre-mixing. Then add the beaten egg, the milk, and the almond oil, stirring just enough until they're moistened and smooth. You want to make sure it's combined and smooth, but you don't want to beat it to death because what's going to happen is you might affect the baking powder. When you're done with these, spoon them into prepared muffin or Madeleine pans. And for the Madeleine pans, about 2/3 full. And if you use, standard Battle pan in this recipe, if you fill them evenly, everything will be just kind of naturally 2/3 full. So what are these Battle pans and muffins and so forth? How can we, how do we prepare these? So in terms of baking them and getting them ready, for if you're going to do these as muffins, you're going to need a muffin tin. You can bake them directly, of course, in the muffin tin. Cleanup is a nightmare. I got kind of tired of that, but I don't like kind of the cupcake cups, the normal like the paper cups you use for those, because with when you take them off, it kind of ruins the crust around it. So I switched to these tulip cups, which are made of parchment, and they tend to give a little better crust if you're going to use a muffin cup at all. And you also have the added benefit of not having to worry about overflow because they tend to be a little taller, so less mess to clean up. Muffins with tulip cups, quick and easy. Once you get these in there, spoon them in about as high as you like, 400 degrees for 20 to 25 minutes, depending on whether you're making 6 or 8. So the size of the muffin will affect the baking time. So do keep an eye on them. You can test them with a toothpick or any kind if you have like a special pastry checker, you can use that. For madeleines, there are 2 types of trays available now. The traditionals, they're both steel. The traditional ones are coated with tin or nickel. That's typically what I use. You can see here, these are ones that I baked during the week. There are nonstick available, but they don't really help that much. And there's also the downside for the nonstick pans. They tend to be dark and affect the baking, and you are under a little bit of risk to burn the outside before the inside finishes. No matter which one you choose, as I said, the nonsticks don't seem to help with being nonstick. You need ample butter and flour. So I tend to melt the butter and use and brush the tins. It's a lot easier. If you try and put it in there with your fingers, it's just a messy, awful job. And you have to flour them too. So butter and flour. This is the best way to make these. It's like, they used to have those muffin top tins. I don't know what happened to that. I can't find those anymore. So I started making these. I mean, everyone eats the top of the muffin, right? I feel so bad for the bottom. But anyway, these go in for 350 degrees for 20 to 25 minutes. Keep an eye on them. It'll, if the milk was cold, if the eggs were cold, it might affect the baking time towards 25 minutes, maybe even beyond. If things were at room temperature, it might be a little shorter. So just keep an eye on those. Some variations on these. So how to enjoy your muffins the most. Ones I baked during the week, I made half and half. I made half plain and half I added some blueberries too. Raspberries also work really well. Basically anything, just be a little careful of things that stick. They do tend, if they're a little bit, if I use heavier berries, it will tend to sink during baking, which is why you'll see here, I just rested them on the top and didn't mix them into the batter. So I just put them on here kind of like the buttons on a snowman and just floated them there and they bake right in. You see the finished product here on the right. They're not as beautiful as a commercial full-fledged madeleine, but they taste great and they have a great crunch to them, which I really like on the outside. I can also, if you don't, if you have some limitation that you can't eat, these because of almonds or a dairy allergy or something like that, just try your favorite muffin recipe in the madeleine tins. It just adds kind of an interesting aspect to the muffins, different shape, as I said, kind of that muffin top type texture. And we'd be, remiss not to talk about beverage pairings here. Great cup of coffee is always welcome. Espresso based drinks also taste great with these. And my favorite is a strong cup of tea of real high quality tea. All these can be regular decaf. A couple months ago, I switched over to decaf. It didn't do anything for my blood pressure, which was kind of the initial intent. But I found I started sleeping way better, so I have stuck with it. The one problem I had is I had trouble finding a decaf tea that actually tasted good. I know they use some kind of water process when they make decaf tea and coffee also. And it takes some of the flavor out. So it tends to be really watery and I didn't like it. So I'm going to just share with you then some of the things that I found that, during this. I'll start with the tea. These are 6-gram tea bags. They're usually, it's decaffeinated. You can it's hard to find. You got to find these. If you're from the Southern United States, you probably recognize this, but they're used to make a pitcher, and I tend to use it for a cup, and it makes it just strong enough. Again, the tulip cups you can get at any good quality store. They'll tend to have these. Almond oil is very difficult to find. I used to be able to get it in a supermarket about 20 years ago. Can't find it anymore. I started ordering it online. That's the only option. And also, I talked about the differences between nonstick and regular pans. You can see the difference in the baking here. The nonstick pan's on the top. You can see it, the Madeline comes out a little bit darker. On the bottom is the way they're typically you're supposed to look. And with the nickel pan, it's a lot easier to get that and also an even bake through it. And that wraps us up for today. Before I take questions, I do want to point you again to let you know that the slides and the list of open source intel and things like that that you can collect are out on this GitHub repo, as well as the source code for that demo pancakes.exe I put out there if you want to use it to kind of practice the techniques here. So at that point, do we have any questions?
Yes, you do. Let me start going through them. All right. Goodness, they all love your muffins. I have to scroll through all the muffin love. Okay, so on MITRE ATT&CK, mapping to MITRE by numbers as a useful KPI for senior leadership. Your suggestions on that?
Yes, it's actually super useful, and especially as a threat hunter, I have used that as one of the KPIs to come out of in terms of measuring effectiveness of the threat hunts. So I use that as an indicator of what we observed, and it's that's typically been very useful for leadership. You can also use that if you're writing incident reports. Also, it's very similar.
Fantastic. The next one is when you're searching for techniques only, do you find the attack navigator helpful on the MITRE ATT&CK GitHub?
When I'm so not necessarily. I have used Navigator to generate heat maps. I find it useful for that, and also maybe to track findings in some special cases. But typically, I've built we built custom tooling around and custom reporting around the tactics that we collect, and we've done reporting that way, not through Navigator. It's a useful tool, though I said I've used it, for heat maps very successfully.
And the final question was on the tulip cups. They want to know more about tulip cups. Are they compostable? Where do you get them?
So compostable, I'm not sure. They are made of parchment. So if I don't know that parchment it is paper, but I don't know, the coating they put on it. I don't know how that affects it. I assume it breaks down at some point in time, but not 100% sure. Was there also a question about where to get them? Did I also know? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, a little bit more about these wonderful tulip cups.
Yes. So if you go to a decent baking supply store, they should have them. Some of the online retailers, you'll probably have a little more selection. They also tend to be difficult to find, like in a physical store. Not everyone carries them. If you do have someone local, like a good baking supply store, I would check there first, because then the person could also they probably are stocking something that works well. Online things tend to be hit or miss. So